The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the rocks. Jedediah kept his body low, a dark shape against the gray scree, tasting the grit it threw in his face. Below him, in the hollow of a wind-scoured boulder, Ilara huddled, a human shield for the two blanket-wrapped bundles at her breast. One of the twins whimpered, a thin, bird-like sound that the gale snatched and tore to pieces. Yet's gaze swept the ridgeline again. Empty. For now. He slid back down the shale, his boots making no sound, a skill learned over 1,000 miles of bad territory. He landed light, his shadow falling over her. She didn't startle. Her eyes, the color of the stormy sky, were already on him. They were sharp, exhausted, and held no room for fear. Fear was a luxury. Anything? Her voice was raw. A whisper scraped from her throat. He shook his head, pulling the canteen from his belt. Ridge is clear. Dust is settled. They're holding back. Or they lost the trail. He didn't believe the second part. Corbett's men didn't lose trails. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to her. She took it, drank 2 short, disciplined swallows, and handed it back. Resourceful, she knew the rules of the trail. He took a sip himself, the water gritty and warm, and screwed the cap on tight. The weight of it felt wrong, too light. "We move in 5, he said. His voice was flat, a tool for conveying information. Nothing more. The west face of this bluff will be in shadow. We can make the dry wash before they get a line of sight." She nodded, shifting one of the babies, whose tiny face was red and chapped from the relentless wind. He saw the faint tremor in her hands and looked away, focusing on the tactical map in his head. A promise was a heavy thing, heavier than a pack or a rifle. "I'll get you home," he told her 2 days ago. Standing in the smoking ruin of her homestead, the bodies of her husband and brother covered with a scorched blanket. He'd owed Caleb that much. Caleb had pulled him from a flash flood on the Cimarron, sharing his fire and his last biscuit without asking a name. A debt was a debt, and now Caleb's wife and children were his to protect. He looked at the promise now, wrapped in wool, its life measured in heartbeats and desperate breaths. He'd promised a woman shielding 2 babies from the wind. He hadn't known then that the wind was the least of it. Corbett wanted this land, but the way he'd come for it, with fire and rifles and the dead of night, spoke of something more than grazing rights. It was a warlord's tactic, meant to scour a place from the map. Jed pulled his rifle closer, the oiled stock smooth and cold under his calloused palm. He ran a thumb over the trigger guard, a familiar ritual. "Ready?" he asked. Ilara finished adjusting the slings that held the infants tight to her body. She looked up, her jaw set. "Ready?" She carried the future. He carried the gun. Together, they rose and slipped into the growing shadows. 2 small figures against a vast, indifferent landscape of rock and sky, moving toward a line on a map that felt a world away. The hunt was on. The pursuit began not with a gunshot, but with a glint of light on the far ridge, sunlight on a spyglass. Jed saw it and didn't break stride. He grabbed Ilara's arm, his grip firm but not rough. "Wash, now." He pointed toward a jagged cut in the earth 100 yards ahead, a scar left by 1,000 years of forgotten floods. It offered cover, but it was a bottleneck, a trap if you didn't know the way out. They ran. The ground was uneven, littered with ankle-turning stones. Ilara moved with a desperate grace, her body curved around the precious weight she carried. The babies were silent, jostled into a fearful stillness. The wind was at their backs, a cold hand pushing them onward. Yet's eyes were everywhere at once, the ground before them, the ridge behind, the sky above. He registered the shape of every rock, every patch of withered sagebrush that might hide a rifleman. He could feel the eyes on his back, the cold calculus of the hunter judging the distance, waiting for a clear shot. They scrambled into the wash, sliding the last few feet in a cascade of loose dirt and pebbles. The walls rose 10 feet on either side, sandstone striped with red and ochre. The world narrowed to this tight, winding corridor. The wind died to a low moan. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing. "How long?" Elara gasped, leaning against the cool rock. Jed was already moving, peering around the next bend. "Not long. They'll flank the wash or follow us in. We need to be gone before they choose." He scanned the canyon walls. He'd been through here once, years ago, chasing a bounty. He remembered a fork, a game trail that climbed out to the high chaparral. It was their only chance. He held up a hand. "Listen." Faintly, from the direction they'd come, came the clatter of a horse's shoe on rock. A single sharp sound. A scout moving fast. "One rider," he said. "Coming in?" His mind worked fast. Fight or flight. Fighting in here was suicide. The ricochets would be deadly. It had to be flight. The trail is up ahead, 100 yards. It's a steep climb. He looked at her, at the double burden she carried. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were resolute. "I can make it," she said, and he believed her. They pushed on, their pace a half-trot. The wash twisted, each bend revealing another empty stretch of sand and rock. The sound of the horse grew louder. The rider was moving carelessly, confident his prey was trapped. That was a mistake. A good tracker never assumed. Jed saw the trail, a faint line cut into the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a mountain goat. "There," he breathed. He gave Elara a boost, his hands on her waist, and she found the first foothold, her fingers clawing for purchase. She started to climb, her movements slow and sure. Jed turned back, rifle ready, his body positioned to block the trail. He was the rear guard. He was the wall. He could hear the horse breathing now, the squeak of saddle leather. He raised the rifle, the iron sights framing the bend in the canyon. A man on a bay horse appeared, rifle held loose across his lap. He had a greasy beard and a cocky grin that vanished the moment he saw Jed. The man's hands tightened on his weapon, but Jed was already there. "Drop it." Yet's voice was low, hard, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking up, seeing Elara partway up the cliff face. A fatal miscalculation. Jed didn't wait for a decision. He fired once. Not at the man, but at the sandstone wall a foot above his head. The report of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. A shower of rock chips and dust rained down, stinging the man's face and spooking his horse. The bay reared, screaming, and the rider fought for control. That was all the time Jed needed. He turned and scrambled up the trail after Elara, the sound of the panicked horse and the cursing man fading below. They hadn't killed him, but they had bought themselves time. And on the trail, time was life. The line shack was a half-collapsed ruin of sod and weathered planks, huddled in the lee of a granite outcrop. It smelled of dust and pack rats, but it was shelter. Jed circled it twice, his senses on high alert, before declaring it clear. Inside, they collapsed, a sudden stillness a shock after the constant motion. While Elara tended to the babies, changing their wrappings, coaxing a few drops of water into their mouths, Jed took inventory. 4 rifle cartridges left. A heel of dried bread, less than a quarter of a canteen of water. The lost pack mule had cost them dearly. They were no longer just pursued. They were on the edge of starvation. He ran a whetstone over his knife with grim, rhythmic strokes. The scraping sound was the only noise besides the fretful sounds of the infants. "We need water," Elara stated, her voice flat with the obvious. "And we can't risk a fire." Jed nodded, not looking up from his blade. "There's a seep marked on an old survey map about 5 miles north of here, hidden in a box canyon. We'll head there at dusk." His eyes scanned the dirt floor of the shack. Something was out of place. A fresh gouge in the hard-packed earth near the wall, next to a pile of rotted burlap sacks. It was the kind of mark a rifle butt would make if used to brace a man against a wall. He moved toward it, nudging the sacks with his boot. Underneath, glinting in the dim light, was a spent brass casing. .44 caliber, same as Corbett's men used. They had been here. Recently, his whole body went cold. They hadn't just been on their trail. They were ahead of it. He kicked aside more of the burlap and found what they had missed. Tucked into a crack between the floor and the wall was a small, tightly folded piece of oilcloth. He worked it free. It wasn't a map fragment. It was a page torn from a journal, the handwriting Caleb's. He recognized the sharp, precise lettering. It was covered in numbers and symbols, a surveyor's shorthand. But there was a message at the bottom, written in plain language. Alara, if you read this, they know. Don't go to Harmony. It's a trap. Follow the river down to the old mission. I left a cache. Godspeed. Jed read it twice, then handed it to her. Her breath hitched as she saw her husband's writing. Her face, already a mask of exhaustion, seemed to crumble for a moment before she mastered herself. He knew, she whispered, tracing the letters with a fingertip. He must have known they were coming. This changed everything. Their destination, the town of Harmony where she had family, was compromised. Corbett wasn't just chasing them. He was hurting them. What does he mean? They know? Jed asked, his voice low. Galara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the secret she was carrying. Caleb wasn't just a rancher, Jedediah. He was a federal surveyor. He was mapping this territory for the government, charting mineral rights. She paused, then delivered the payload. He found something big. Something Corbett wants badly enough to burn a family out of their home and salt the earth. So this wasn't about land. It was about treasure. And Caleb's survey logs were the map. Jed looked from the note to the 2 sleeping babies. A new, terrible understanding dawned. The logs weren't just paper. They were the most valuable thing in the territory. And he had a grim suspicion of where Caleb would have hidden them. He looked at the babies, then back at Alara. The stakes had just been raised, impossibly high. The box canyon was a tight, ugly fissure in the earth, its entrance choked with thorny mesquite. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Jed approached it like a wolf, using every rock and shadow for cover, moving in a wide, semicircular path to check for tracks. He found them. 3 sets of boot prints, less than a day old, leading into the canyon, but no tracks leading out. They were waiting. He crept back to where Alara was hidden with the twins. They're in there, he whispered, his mouth close to her ear. 3 of them, dug in around the seep. She didn't flinch. Then we can't get the water. We have to, he said. The canteens were empty. The babies were growing listless. Dehydration was a faster killer than a bullet. They're expecting us to come in the front. We won't. He pointed up. The canyon walls were steep, but not sheer. A series of ledges and cracks offered a treacherous path to the rim. I'll climb the west wall, get above them. You stay here. When you hear my shot, that's your signal. But don't run for the water. You run away from the canyon. North. There's a stand of cottonwoods a mile out. Wait for me there. Her eyes widened. You're going in alone? They're watching the mouth of the canyon, not the sky, he said. They'll never see me coming. It was a lie. It was a desperate, risky plan, and they both knew it. Before she could argue, he pressed the rifle into her hands. If I'm not at the cottonwoods by dawn, you keep going. Don't stop. He took his knife and his last 4 cartridges. I'll be there, he said, a creed spoken in plain speech. The climb was brutal. The rock was rotten, crumbling under his fingers and boots. Twice he nearly fell, the drop below enough to shatter bone. He moved with agonizing slowness, testing every hold, his muscles screaming in protest. Below, he could hear the low murmur of men's voices, the clink of a canteen against rock. They were confident, bored. He reached the rim as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and rust. He crawled on his belly to the edge and looked down. 3 men, just as he'd thought. They were huddled around a small muddy pool of water, passing a flask between them. One was watching the canyon entrance. The other 2 had their rifles propped against a rock, out of reach. Jed took a steadying breath. He had 1 shot. He had to make it count. He couldn't kill all 3, but he could create chaos. He chose his target, not a man, but a large, precariously balanced boulder on the canyon wall directly above them. He raised his pistol, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the canyon. The bullet sparked against the boulder, and for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the massive rock shifted, tilted, and plunged downward. It struck the canyon floor with the force of a thunderclap, shattering into 1,000 pieces and throwing up a cloud of dust and rock shards. The men screamed, diving for cover. Jed didn't wait to see the result. He was already scrambling back from the edge as 2 rifles opened up, firing blindly at the rim. Bullets whined past his head. He didn't fire back. He just ran, weaving through the rocks, heading north. He heard a 3rd rifle join the fray Alara's. A single covering shot from a distance, just as they'd planned. It would pull their attention, make them think the attack came from the front. He ran harder, his lungs burning, the image of her face his only focus. They had survived. But they had no water, no supplies, and the enemy now knew exactly how resourceful they were. The game had changed. The trading post at Harmony Creek wasn't a town, just a ramshackle building of unpainted wood squatting under a lonely butte. It was the rendezvous from Caleb's note. Follow the river down to the old mission. The mission was dust, but this post, run by a man named Silas, had been built on its ruins. Caleb had written, "Silas can be trusted." Jed didn't trust anyone, but they were out of options. They'd spent a day and a night without water, a silent, stumbling journey through the drylands. The baby's cries had weakened to pitiful mews. Yet's tongue was a swollen lump in his mouth. Alara's face was a mask of gaunt determination. They approached the post at dawn, seeing no horses at the hitching rail. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Jed left Alara and the children hidden in an arroyo 100 yards back and went in alone. The door creaked open into a single large room that smelled of cured leather, tobacco, and something else, something metallic and wrong. A portly, balding man with a nervous sweat on his brow stood behind a rough-hewn counter. "Silas, looking for something?" Silas asked, his eyes darting toward the door. Yet's hand never strayed far from his pistol. "Water and supplies. A friend said you were reliable. Caleb Smith." At the name, Silas's face went pale. He licked his lips. "Caleb. Haven't seen him in a long time." A lie. The fear rolling off him was fresh. Yet's eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of the room. He saw it then. A boot, sticking out from behind a stack of barrels in the back corner. A new boot, the kind Corbett's men wore. "You're alone here, Silas?" Jed asked, his voice dangerously soft. Silas's Adam's apple bobbed. "Just me, all by my lonesome." From the back room, a floorboard groaned. It was the oldest tell in the book. Jed drew his pistol in a single fluid motion. "Tell your friend to come out. Slow and easy." Silas's face crumpled. "Don't shoot. He made me. Corbett's man. He—" A shadow moved in the doorway to the back. A tall, raw-boned man with dead eyes stepped into the room, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He wasn't pointing it. He was just holding it. A statement. "The woman," a man said, his voice a low rasp. "And the brats. Corbett wants them. Says you can walk away, Pathfinder. Your debt to Smith is paid. He's dead." It was a trap. The note, the rendezvous. Corbett had known it all. Silas was the bait. Yet's mind raced. 2 men, maybe more, outside. He was outgunned. His gaze flickered to a large mirror, hanging behind the counter, angled just so. In it, he could see the reflection of the front window. A horseman was sitting still, watching the arroyo where he'd left Ilara. They were pinned. The man with the shotgun smiled, a humorless crack in his face. "You're smart. You see how it is. Just give us the woman. The silver map is all Corbett really wants. The silver map." So that's what they thought the logs were. A simple treasure map. They didn't understand the federal claim, the legitimacy Caleb's work represented. "The map is gone," Jed lied, his voice steady. "Burned with the ranch." The man's smile faded. "Corbett ain't gonna like that." He started to raise the shotgun. Jed didn't wait. He kicked the leg of a heavy wooden table, sending it crashing over. In the same motion, he fired his pistol, not at the man, but at the large sack of flour on the counter next to Silas. The sack exploded, filling the room with a choking white cloud. The shotgun roared, the blast tearing a hole in the wall where Jed had been a second before. He was already moving, diving behind the overturned table, using the whiteout for cover. He scrambled for the back door, knowing it was his only chance. He burst out into the harsh sunlight, firing a single shot at the horseman outside to make him duck. Then he ran, not away, but back toward the arroyo. The trap had been sprung. Now, all that was left was the escape. The main routes were gone. The options had narrowed to one: a deadly, forgotten trail over the high peaks. The dead man's switchback. The clouds on the horizon were no longer a vague threat. They were a bruised, purple wall, marching steadily closer. The first winter storm. It was their ticking clock. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved by wind and time, a temporary reprieve. The escape from the trading post had cost them the last of their energy. Ilara's arm had been grazed by a shotgun pellet, a shallow but painful wound. Jed cleaned it with the last of the whiskey from his flask and bound it with a strip torn from his own shirt. He worked in silence, his movements efficient. They sat by a small, smokeless fire of dried mesquite roots, the heat a small comfort against the creeping cold. The babies slept, their tiny chests rising and falling in the firelight. For the first time, the sheer impossibility of their situation settled on him. 1 man, 1 woman, 2 infants, against a warlord and the coming winter. "There's only one way left," he said, breaking the silence. He drew a rough map in the dirt with the tip of his knife. "The dead man's switchback. It goes over the dragon's tooth peaks. It's not a trail, really. More like a goat path. But it's the only route Corbett won't be expecting." Ilara stared at the crude lines in the dirt. "Can we make it? With them?" She gestured to the sleeping children. Jed looked at the swaddled bundles. "We have to." He began a silent gear check, the grim accounting of a desperate man. He tore a spare blanket into strips, fashioning a more secure harness for Ilara to carry one twin on her back, leaving her hands free. He rewrapped the other to be carried on her front. He sharpened his knife until the edge was a razor. He counted his cartridges. 3 left. Everything had to have a purpose. Everything had to work. The plan was no longer just about running. It was about enduring an opponent far older and more ruthless than Corbett, the mountain itself. As he worked, Ilara finally spoke the words he'd been waiting for. "It's not a silver map, Jedediah." "Not just that." She carefully unwrapped one of the babies. From a hidden pocket sewn into the thick wool lining of the swaddling clothes, she pulled a thin, oilskin-wrapped packet. She handed it to him. He opened it. Inside were not maps, but survey logs, pages filled with Caleb's precise script, detailing geological data, elevation markers, and boundary lines, all stamped with an official federal seal. "Caleb filed a federal claim," she said, her voice low and fierce. "The silver lode is on protected Ute land. His survey proves it's part of the reservation. Corbett can't just take it. He needs these logs to forge a new survey, to make his claim look legal. Without these, the silver is just a rumor. With them, he can steal it from the Ute, and the government will back him up." Jed stared at the papers, the weight of them far heavier than their few ounces. This wasn't just about wealth anymore. It was about law, about the theft of a future from an entire people. And Caleb had hidden the proof, the truth, in the only place he knew would be protected with a life-or-death ferocity, with his children. He carefully folded the logs and handed them back to Elara. She tucked them safely back into the lining, her movements full of reverence. "I understand," he said. The two words hung in the small cave, a vow renewed. He was no longer just paying a debt to a dead man. He was a guardian of a truth, a fragile, paper-thin shield against a tide of greed. He looked to the mountain pass, then to the storm. It was a race, and the only prize was tomorrow. The ascent began in a cold pre-dawn gray. The dead man's switchback was aptly named. The trail was a scar on the face of the mountain, a narrow ledge that clung to the sheer granite cliffs. The wind, a precursor to the storm, howled in the jagged peaks above, a constant physical pressure that threatened to tear them from their holes. Jed went first. He was the anchor. Every step was a calculation of weight and balance. The rock was slick with moisture, the air thin and cold. He tested every handhold, every foothold, before putting his full weight on it. He moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a man in silent argument with gravity. He'd tied one end of his lariat around his waist. The other was tied to Elara. It wasn't for catching a fall here would take them both down. It was a lifeline, a physical connection in this vertical world, a way for her to feel his progress, to match his pace. Elara followed, a few yards behind. One baby was strapped to her back, the other to her chest. She was a study in fierce concentration, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the rock. She never looked down. Her world had shrunk to the few feet of trail in front of her, the feel of the rope at her waist, and the warm, fragile weight of her children. The mountain was a living thing, an adversary. Loose scree slid under their boots, rattling into the abyss below. The wind tore at their clothes, trying to find a purchase. They didn't speak. Words were a waste of breath, and breath was precious. Their communication was in the slight tug of the rope, the scraped sound of a boot finding a hold. Hours passed. The sun rose, a weak, watery light that offered no warmth. They paused on a slightly wider ledge, barely big enough for them both to stand. Jed passed the canteen back. Elara drank, then used a damp cloth to wet the lips of the twins. They were strangely quiet, lulled by the rhythmic motion and the immense, humming silence of the high places. Jed stared back the way they had come. The world spread out below them, a rumpled blanket of brown and green. He could see for 100 miles, and he saw what he was looking for. A small plume of dust, miles away, moving fast. Corbett. He hadn't been fooled. He was coming. "He's on our trail," Jed said. The words were snatched by the wind. Elara looked, her eyes following his pointing finger. She showed no fear, only a grim acceptance. "Faster?" she asked. He shook his head. "Faster is dead. We just keep moving." They were no longer just climbing against the storm. They were climbing against the man behind them. The rope tightened. Jed started moving again, pulling them upward, into the wind, into the clouds, toward the jagged teeth of the summit. Every foot gained was a victory, every breath a defiance. The terrain was the enemy, the clock was the storm, and the devil was on their heels. The gauntlet had been thrown down. Corbett reined in his black stallion, the animal chuffing impatiently in the cold air. He raised his spyglass, the brass cool against his eye, and scanned the sheer face of the dragon's tooth. He wasn't looking for dust. He was looking for mistakes. A glint of metal, a patch of color that didn't belong, the tiny, slow-moving shape of a human being. He found them. 2 small specks, less than halfway up the switchback. He let out a low, appreciative whistle. "Damn fool," he said to the man beside him, a lean, scarred tracker named Pike. "He's actually trying it." Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice. "It's a long way to fall." Corbett snapped the spyglass shut. He had to admire the man's grit. This pathfinder, this Jedediah, was a professional. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't run blindly. When cornered, he had chosen the most improbable, most dangerous route of escape, a predictable kind of desperation. And Corbett always preyed on predictability. "He thinks we'll follow him up that rock," Corbett said, a thin smile on his lips. "He thinks it's a race he can win by being tougher than we are." He turned in his saddle, looking at the 24 riders behind him, a private army of hard men who followed him for coin and carnage. "We're not tougher. We're smarter." He pointed Pike toward the pass. "You take 3 men, the best climbers. You're not chasing him. You're heading him off. There's a hunter's trail that cuts across the northern shoulder. It's faster than that switchback if you've got the stomach for it. You'll beat him to the summit. I want you waiting for him when he crawls over that last ridge." Pike grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "A reception party. I like it." "No bodies," Corbett commanded, his voice dropping to a cold, flat tone. "I want the woman, and I want those logs. The pathfinder. You can leave him for the buzzards. But I want the logs intact. Is that clear? Clear as a bell, boss." As Pike and his hand-picked men broke off, spurred their horses toward the northern trail, Corbett turned his attention to the rest of his force. He pointed toward the wide, circuitous valley road that bypassed the mountain range entirely. "The rest of you with me. We'll ride around. We'll be waiting at the bottom when he comes down the other side. If Pike doesn't get him at the top, we'll get him at the bottom." He had them boxed in. A hammer at the summit, an anvil in the valley below. It was a classic pincer movement, a strategy he'd learned in the war. You didn't chase a clever enemy. You encircled him. You cut off his escape until he had nowhere left to run. He looked up at the mountain one last time, at the 2 tiny figures crawling like insects toward the storm clouds. He felt no anger, no malice. This was business. The pathfinder was a tool who had outlived his usefulness. The woman was a vessel carrying his property. The land, the silver, the power that was the prize. Jedediah could have his honor, his courage, his debt. Corbett would have the future. He spurred his horse forward, leading his men into the valley. The trap was set. All he had to do now was wait. They reached the summit ridge in a state of near collapse. The air was razor-thin, and the wind was a physical blow, threatening to rip them from the mountain. Below, the world was a sea of churning gray cloud. They had climbed into the maw of the storm. Jed hauled himself over the last ledge, his hands raw, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. He turned and pulled Alara up, her weight a dead thing on the rope until her boots found purchase. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, her body curled around the 2 infants. For a moment, they were safe. A narrow, wind-swept saddle of rock, maybe 20 feet across, before the trail descended the other side. "We made it," she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. Jed didn't answer. His eyes were scanning the rocks around them. Something was wrong. The silence. The wind howled, but there was no other sound. No birds. No life. A hunter's instinct, honed over years of survival, screamed at him. He saw it then. A scuff mark on a patch of lichen that shouldn't be there. A dislodged pebble. They were not alone. "Get down," he hissed, pulling her behind a low outcrop of granite. As if on cue, a rifle shot cracked, the sound thin in the high altitude. A bullet sparked off the rock, where Ilara's head had been a second before. A second shot, from a different angle, kicked up a spray of gravel near his feet. Pike's men. They were here, waiting, pinned down. 4 of them, he guessed, spread out in a semicircle, controlling the summit. They were trapped on the roof of the world. Yet's mind was a flurry of cold calculation. He had 3 cartridges left, not enough for a firefight. He needed a different weapon. He looked around, his eyes cataloging the terrain. Rock, wind, a steep drop-off on either side. He unslung the small lantern from his pack. He still had a little oil. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. He handed his pistol to Ilara. "When I move, I need you to fire, not at them, at the rocks above them. Make them keep their heads down." She nodded, her face grim, understanding immediately. It wasn't about hitting them. It was about distraction. He lit the lantern, the flames sputtering in the wind. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, tied it to his lariat, and tied the other end to the lantern's handle. He began to swing it, a slow circle at first, then faster and faster, a flickering light in the growing gloom. Then he yelled, a raw primal sound, and hurled the lantern with all his might. It sailed in a high arc, not toward the ambushers, but off to the side, over the ledge. The riflemen, their attention drawn by the sudden light and sound, instinctively fired at it. 2 shots boomed out, chasing the phantom light into the abyss. In that split second of distraction, Jed moved. He broke from cover, running low, not toward the enemy, but toward the steep, snow-dusted slope at the far end of the saddle. Ilara fired the pistol, the shots echoing his movements, the bullets sparking high on the cliff face above the hidden riflemen, forcing them to duck. It bought him the 3 seconds he needed. He reached the slope and, using his knife, began hacking furiously at the cornice of snow and ice that clung to the edge, a small, unstable shelf built up by the wind. The ambushers, realizing the trick, turned their fire on him. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his jacket. Another screamed past his ear, but it was too late. With a deep, groaning crack, the cornice gave way. The avalanche was not a thundering cataclysm, but a swift, hissing tide of snow and ice. It poured down the narrow gully where 2 of Pike's men had taken cover, a white wave that swept them away in a heartbeat. The other 2, higher up, were untouched, but their position was exposed, their advantage gone. They fired wildly at Jed, who was already scrambling back to Ilara, pulling her deeper into the shelter of the rocks. The balance had shifted, but it wasn't over. Through the swirling snow of the coming storm, a new figure appeared on the ridge. A big man on a black horse, moving with an unnerving calm. Corbett. He must have taken the hunter's trail himself, leaving his main force below. He was flanked by Pike. They didn't draw their weapons. They just sat there, 2 dark silhouettes against the gray sky, blocking the path down. "Jedediah!" Corbett's voice was powerful, carrying easily over the wind. "You've made your point. You're a formidable man. But it's over. Give me the logs and the woman. I'll let you ride out of here with your life." Jed pushed Ilara further behind him. He had 2 cartridges left. Corbett had an army in the valley. The math was simple. It was a checkmate. "The logs are federal property," Jed shouted back, his voice hoarse. "You're a thief and a murderer." Corbett laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I'm a businessman. This is my territory. The law is what I say it is. Last chance. Don't make me kill those children to get what's mine." Ilara stiffened behind him. That was the line. The final unforgivable threat. Jed knew there would be no deals, no walking away. His eyes darted around, looking for an out. There was none. Only the cliff face, the storm, and the two men blocking the trail. A decisive tactical choice. He wasn't fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting for a 5-minute head start. He looked up, above Corbett and Pike. The mountain was groaning under the weight of the new snow. The avalanche he had started was small, but it had destabilized the whole slope. A single well-placed shot. He raised his rifle. It was a shot he couldn't afford to miss. He wasn't aiming at Corbett. He was aiming 100 feet above him, at a massive overhang of snow, a hanging glacier of white death. The wind tore at him, trying to push the rifle barrel off target. The snow was beginning to fall in thick, wet flakes, blurring his vision. He took a breath, held it, and let the world narrow to the front sight and a patch of white. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a dark line appeared across the snowfield above Corbett. The line fractured. With a sound like the world cracking in two, the entire mountainside began to move. Pike screamed and spurred his horse, trying to bolt. Corbett just sat there, his face a mask of disbelief, as a tidal wave of snow and rock erupted above him. Jed grabbed Elara. Now! We run! He didn't wait to see the outcome. He plunged down the opposite side of the summit, half running, half sliding down the treacherous path, pulling her with him. Behind them, the roar of the avalanche was the sound of a closing door, a final, thunderous end to the pursuit. He hadn't killed Corbett. He had buried the path. They found shelter in a thick stand of pine trees halfway down the mountain, in a basin protected from the storm's fury. The avalanche had sealed the pass. The roar had faded, replaced by the muffled quiet of falling snow. For the first time in days, they were not running. They were simply surviving. Jed built a small fire in a pit dug deep into the snow, the flames a pocket of warmth and life in the encroaching wilderness. The snow fell thick and steady, erasing their tracks, burying the world in a blanket of white. It was their shield. Elara, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, gently unwrapped the babies. They were cold and hungry, but alive. She fed them the last of their rations, a thin gruel of crushed hardtack, mixed with melted snow, and rewrapped them in dry blankets. Jed watched her, his hands cupped around the fire. The rope burn on his shoulder throbbed with a dull ache. He had a deep gash on his leg from a rock he slid over during the descent. Minor wounds, the price of escape. He took out his knife and heated the blade in the fire. Without a word, he tore his pant leg and pressed the searing metal against the cut to cauterize it. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. He didn't make a sound. Elara looked up from the children, her eyes meeting his across the small fire. The shared ordeal had stripped away everything but the essential. There was a new understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged in terror and tenacity. Is he? She started to ask, her voice barely a whisper. Gone, Jed said. He didn't know if Corbett was alive or dead, buried under 100 tons of rock and snow. It didn't matter. For now, the threat was neutralized. The path was closed. He had fulfilled the first part of his promise. He had gotten them through. He looked at the swaddling clothes where the survey logs were hidden. He had paid his debt to Caleb Smith, but the weight of this new responsibility, the guardianship of those papers, and the people they represented had settled on him. It was a heavier burden than any he had carried before. He felt a small hand touch his arm. It was Elara. She held out a clean strip of cloth. Let me bind that for you, she said quietly. He allowed her to. Her touch was gentle, professional. As she wrapped the bandage around his leg, a silence fell between them, comfortable and profound. The costs were being tallied. Wounds tended, debts paid, and new ones incurred. They were alive. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by a world that had tried to kill them, they had found a moment of peace. The fire crackled, the snow fell, and the two babies slept, oblivious to the war that had been fought for their future. The settlement of redemption wasn't on any map. It was a handful of sturdy cabins tucked into a deep, wooded valley, populated by prospectors, Ute families, and others who had reason to want the world to forget them. It was the home Jed had been aiming for, a place where a woman with two babies and a dangerous secret could disappear. They arrived 3 days after the storm, gaunt and weary, leading a mule they bought from a lone trapper with the last of Jed's silver. The valley was green and quiet, a world away from the wind-blasted peaks they had crossed. A woman with a kind, weathered face and braided gray hair came out of the largest cabin. She was Ute. Ilara spoke to her in a low, respectful tone, mentioning her husband's name. The woman's eyes widened in recognition, then softened with sorrow. She looked at Ilara, at the babies, at the weary man standing guard beside them, and simply nodded. They were taken in. That evening, Ilara sat with the Ute elders, the precious oilskin packet open on the table between them. She explained everything: the silver, Corbett's greed, her husband's work to protect their claim. Jed stood by the door, his job done. He was an outsider here, his purpose fulfilled. He had delivered the message. Later, as dusk settled over the valley, Ilara found him by the corral, checking the tack on his horse. "They'll be safe here," she said. "The elders will take the logs to the federal marshal at the agency. Caleb's work won't be for nothing." "Good," he said, not turning around. "The claim will be worth a fortune," she continued. "A share of it is yours. You earned it." He finally turned to face her. In the soft light, he could see the lines of exhaustion on her face were beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, quiet strength. "Debts paid," he said. It was all the explanation needed. He had started this journey to honor a debt to a dead friend. He was leaving it a different man. The isolation he had cultivated for years had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet courage of a woman and the helpless weight of 2 infants. He had been reminded of a world beyond survival, a world of duty and community. He swung himself up into the saddle. He looked down at her, a promise kept, a future secured. "I'll get you home," he had said, and he had. "Where will you go?" she asked, one hand resting on his saddle. He looked west, toward the setting sun, toward the vast, empty horizons that had always been his only companion. "On," he said. He gave a slight nod, a gesture that was both a farewell and a final mark of respect. He nudged his horse forward, riding out of the small, protected valley and back into the wild, open land. The land was the same, vast and unforgiving. But the man who rode across it was not.